something extraordinary appears to have happened behind the closed doors of Sandringham. King Charles was reportedly working on a private legal change that could dramatically reshape the future of royal wealth, and his own family may not have known what was happening until it was already too late. This was not simply another palace disagreement. The story centers on private assets, inheritance arrangements, legal documents, and decisions powerful enough to change who controls certain parts of the royal family's financial future. And the most surprising detail? The people closest to the situation may have discovered the changes only after the machinery behind them had already started moving. Welcome to Crownora Updates, where we look beyond the headlines and follow the details behind the royal drama. Because once the timeline begins, the story becomes much harder to ignore. It reportedly began on a cold morning at Sandringham. Inside the estate, a private document was being examined. On the surface, it appeared to concern an ordinary property matter. But hidden within the wording was something far more important. The document was connected to the management of private royal assets. At almost the same time, the estate's communication systems reportedly became unavailable. Screens went blank. Connections stopped. Staff attempting to restore the systems discovered that access had been restricted. At first, the obvious explanation was a technical failure. Then came the discovery that changed everything. The interruption appeared to have been deliberate. The estate had effectively been separated from parts of the wider palace network. That immediately raised a difficult question. Why would such extreme measures be necessary for a simple legal document? And why was the work being handled so privately? William was reportedly not given the answers. From Kensington Palace, financial information connected to the sovereign's private arrangements suddenly became difficult to access. Calls were made. The usual channels were contacted. But the message coming back was simple. The king was not to be disturbed. For William, that explanation created even more questions. If Charles was simply resting, why had the systems been isolated? Why were legal papers being moved? And why were senior officials acting as though something much larger was taking place? Then another detail appeared. A sealed package was reportedly removed from the king's private area and transferred to a waiting courier. No public announcement accompanied it. No explanation was offered. The movement was quiet, almost invisible. And that was exactly what made it so unsettling. The issue was apparently not just a future inheritance. It involved the structure surrounding private royal wealth. According to the story presented in the original account, the document was an amendment designed to change how certain non-crown assets would eventually be distributed. That distinction matters, because crown assets and private assets do not necessarily operate under the same rules. The document was therefore being treated as something more than a normal family arrangement. It was becoming an active legal instrument. And once the process began, stopping it could become extremely difficult. The financial assets reportedly included investments, securities, and other holdings separate from the better-known royal estates. For decades, such arrangements had allegedly been handled through private trustees and legal structures. But now, those structures were being changed. A transfer had reportedly been prepared shortly before the communication systems went offline. That meant the process was already moving before the wider family understood what was happening. And then came the most controversial part. The document reportedly relied on an old legal provision that gave the reigning monarch extraordinary control during what could be described as an exceptional family situation. If that provision was valid, Charles could potentially make major decisions without first obtaining approval from his heirs. That changed the meaning of the entire episode. This was no longer simply a father making a private financial decision. It suggested that the king was treating the situation as an institutional matter, and that distinction would become crucial. A legal team in Norwich was reportedly waiting for the documents. The courier arrived. The papers were checked. Signatures were reviewed. Within minutes, the amendment was being treated as legally active. And somewhere inside that process, the future financial map of the royal family was changing. But Charles was apparently not finished. A second set of documents reportedly concerned Prince Harry. The paperwork allegedly targeted financial provisions connected to trusts established for the younger generation of the family. The key change involved residency. Under the arrangement described in the transcript, A beneficiary living outside the British Isles for a prolonged period could lose access to certain benefits. The timing was striking. Harry had stepped away from active royal duties in 2020. The 5-year period described in the document appeared to line up almost perfectly. That raised an obvious question. Was the rule really designed for everyone? Or had it been written with one particular situation in mind? If the provision were applied to Harry, the consequences could be serious. Certain funds would no longer remain available to him in the same way. Instead, they could return to a wider family-controlled structure. But the document allegedly contained another powerful condition. If a beneficiary challenged the arrangement in court, additional financial information could potentially become exposed. In simple terms, fighting the decision could create another problem. The dispute could become public. That would place enormous pressure on anyone considering legal action. And suddenly, the inheritance issue was no longer just about money. It was about leverage. Harry's representatives reportedly received a copy of the amendment. Questions were raised. The response was that the changes had been made under a special legal authority. There would be no simple family mediation. No easy internal appeal. The document was already moving through the system. Then another item appeared in the asset schedule. A piece of jewelry connected to Diana. According to the account, a historic tiara had been removed from the private inheritance structure and reclassified as an official state asset. That seemingly small change carried enormous consequences. If the item became part of the state collection, it would no longer be treated as ordinary family property. It could not simply be transferred abroad. It could not be used as private collateral. And it could not automatically pass down through the family as previously expected. But the jewelry was only the beginning. The documents allegedly reached even deeper into the family's private history. Among the assets were personal letters written by Harry during his childhood and teenage years. These letters reportedly existed in secure storage. The amendment allegedly changed control over their publication rights. And that created another extraordinary situation. A person's own childhood memories could potentially become tied to legal ownership. If the arrangement worked as described, future books, documentaries, or other projects using those letters could face restrictions. The issue was no longer simply inheritance. It was control over history itself. For Harry, the consequences could therefore extend beyond finances. His ability to tell certain parts of his own story could potentially be affected. And all of this was happening without a public confrontation. No shouting match. No dramatic palace announcement. Just paperwork. That may have been the coldest part of the entire story, because Charles did not need to publicly attack his son. He could simply change the legal structure surrounding the assets. Back in London, the legal community was reportedly beginning to take notice. The palace was no longer attempting to manage the family dispute through statements and public relations. Instead, the conflict appeared to be moving into a far more technical world. Property deeds, trust agreements, inheritance clauses, access restrictions, and legal authority. Then William arrived at Sandringham. His arrival was reportedly unexpected. His aircraft landed under unusual circumstances, and the normal security process appeared to have been bypassed. William wanted answers. Instead, he was reportedly told that the upper floor had been placed under restricted access. The explanation involved the king's private medical arrangements. But again, something did not add up. The central elevator was unavailable. Security doors were locked. And William discovered that his own emergency access privileges had apparently been removed. He tried the biometric scanner. It rejected him. The future King of Britain was standing outside a private section of his own family's estate, and the system would not let him through. That moment changed the atmosphere completely. William contacted security officials. The answer reportedly came back that the police had not ordered the change. The access restriction had apparently been made through an internal administrative system. That meant the order had come from within the royal financial and administrative structure itself. William was effectively locked out by the same institution he was destined to lead. And then he saw something through the glass. Sir Clive Alderton was carrying a locked leather case. A special transit tag was attached to it. The case was not being taken to an ordinary archive. It appeared to be heading somewhere outside the normal palace system. William demanded an explanation, but the response was clear. The king had ordered staff to maintain silence until the documents had left the estate. At that point, William had a choice. He could force the issue and create a public confrontation, or he could step back and let his lawyers investigate. He chose the second option. Inside the library, William began examining historical agreements. And this is where the story became even more complicated. The question was no longer simply what Charles had changed. It was whether previous agreements had already given him the power to make those changes. William's legal team reportedly began reviewing old property arrangements. One document from several years earlier became particularly important. It concerned a routine restructuring of royal property. At the time, it appeared harmless. But buried inside the agreement was reportedly a clause allowing the reigning monarch to make equivalent adjustments to certain non-land assets during a major family restructuring. A routine signature had potentially created a powerful future lever, and William may not have realized how important that clause would become. This was the kind of legal detail that could change everything without anyone noticing. The rain outside began to ease. But inside Sandringham, the pressure was increasing. A private meeting was being prepared. Legal witnesses were arriving. Documents were being checked. And the amendment was approaching its final stage. The witnesses could not simply be family members. They needed to meet the legal requirements surrounding the signing. Their role was to confirm that the process had been completed correctly. William entered the room with his own concerns. He reportedly argued that some of the assets being moved might not belong entirely to Charles. Some could potentially be connected to the future Prince of Wales. If that was true, the amendment could affect more than the king's private property. It could touch assets connected to the institution's future leadership. The room became tense. William's team wanted the process paused, but the palace legal representatives appeared prepared. They produced another agreement. This older document allegedly contained the authority they needed. The clause that William had not noticed years earlier was now being used to support the king's action. That was the moment the balance shifted. William had arrived hoping to challenge the process. Instead, he discovered that the paperwork had already anticipated his objection. Then Charles entered. He reportedly walked into the room quietly. He did not engage in a public argument with his son.
He went to the desk.
The document was placed before him.
He signed.
One witness followed. Then another. Then the final witness. The entire process reportedly took only minutes. And there was no emotional conversation between father and son. That silence said more than an argument could have. Once the final signature was added, the document was sealed and secured. The legal process was complete. William could no longer stop it simply by objecting. The king left the room. William remained behind. And the significance of that moment was enormous. Because when William eventually becomes king, he may inherit not only the crown, but also the legal structure created by his father. That structure could limit how certain private assets are managed. It could place conditions on access. And it could permanently change how parts of the family's wealth are controlled. But there was still another secret. William reportedly discovered a financial statement hidden inside an old diary. The account showed that a major offshore balance had already been removed shortly before the amendment was signed. At first, this looked alarming. Had the money been moved overseas? Had it been transferred to someone outside the family? Had Charles secretly moved the fortune beyond William's reach? The answer was more complicated. The funds had apparently not disappeared. They had been redirected. Instead of remaining under direct family control, they had reportedly been placed into an independent endowment dedicated to maintaining historic royal buildings. That meant the money could no longer simply be treated as a private family fortune. It had been tied to the preservation of the institution. And that was arguably the most strategic part of the entire arrangement. Charles had not simply taken money away from his heirs. He had allegedly transformed its legal purpose. The wealth could now be used for buildings, restoration, and institutional preservation rather than personal spending. If the legal structure held, future monarchs could have little power to redirect those funds without major legal intervention. In other words, Charles had built a wall around the money. And that wall was made from legal language. For William, This created a strange inheritance. He would one day receive the crown, but he might inherit less freedom over certain private resources than previous monarchs enjoyed. The institution would receive protection. The individual monarch would receive restrictions. And that may have been exactly what Charles wanted. The story therefore reaches far beyond one family disagreement. It raises a much larger question. What happens when a monarch decides that protecting the institution is more important than protecting family harmony? For generations, royal families have survived disagreements. Arguments come and go. Titles change. Relationships become distant. But legal documents can last much longer than personal anger. A conversation can be forgotten. A signature can remain binding for decades. And that is why this alleged Sandringham episode is so striking. The most powerful move was not made in front of cameras. It was made at a desk, with paperwork, with witnesses, and with a pen. William eventually left the estate. His helicopter rose above the grounds. From the air, Sandringham looked peaceful. Nothing about the building suggested that a major internal battle had just taken place. The windows were still. The grounds were quiet. The palace continued functioning as if nothing had happened. But behind those walls, the rules had reportedly changed. The future king had been denied access to a private area of the estate. Harry's alleged financial position had been placed under new conditions. Historic family property had reportedly been reclassified. Private correspondence had allegedly been placed under new legal control, and a significant pool of wealth had been redirected toward the preservation of royal property. All of it had happened within hours. No public vote, no dramatic announcement, no televised confrontation, just a sequence of legal decisions. And perhaps that is what makes the story so compelling. Royal power is often imagined as something visible.
Crowns,
Palaces, ceremonies, speeches. But some of the most important decisions may happen somewhere much quieter. Inside legal offices, inside private meetings, inside documents that most people will never see. The real battle is sometimes not about who stands beside the king. It is about who controls what remains after the king is gone. And if the account is accurate, Charles may have been thinking far beyond the present conflict. He may have been designing a financial system that would survive him. A system where certain assets could no longer be freely divided among family members. A system where institutional property would remain protected. A system where future heirs would inherit responsibility, but not necessarily unrestricted control. That creates an uncomfortable possibility for William. He could inherit the most important position in the monarchy, while discovering that parts of the financial system surrounding that position have already been locked into place. And for Harry, the consequences could be even more personal. The alleged changes would not simply affect money. They could affect family property, private records, and the ability to control parts of his own story. Yet perhaps the most important question remains unanswered. Why would Charles choose such an aggressive legal strategy? Was it purely about protecting the crown? Was it about preventing future disputes? Was it a response to years of family tension? Or was the king trying to make sure that the monarchy could survive even if the family itself remained divided? There is another possibility. Perhaps Charles understood something that previous monarchs did not. Money can divide a family, but institutions can survive when money is placed beyond personal control. By tying assets to buildings, trusts, and legal conditions, he could make those resources serve the monarchy rather than individual members of the family. That may explain why the final arrangement was reportedly so detailed. The goal was not simply to punish. The goal was to control what happened next. And that is why the story does not really end with the signing. The signature was only the beginning. The true consequences would emerge years later, when William becomes king. When future generations ask who owns what, when lawyers examine old documents, and when the next generation discovers that decisions made behind closed doors decades earlier still shape their choices. That is the strange power of royal paperwork. It can outlive the people who created it. A king can leave office. A prince can become monarch. A family can reconcile. But a carefully written legal clause can remain silent, waiting. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Sandringham story. The biggest royal battles do not always happen in public. Sometimes they happen quietly, on a rainy afternoon, inside a room where only a few people are present. There is no shouting, no crowd, no cameras, only a document placed on a desk, a signature at the bottom, and a future that suddenly looks very different. As William's helicopter disappeared into the gray sky, Sandringham remained behind. The estate looked exactly as it had that morning. But according to the story, the financial structure surrounding the House of Windsor had changed. The lines of inheritance had shifted, the boundaries of control had moved, and the consequences could continue long after everyone involved is gone. For Crown Aura updates, that is the part worth watching. Not simply what happened inside the palace, but what those decisions could mean for the future of the monarchy. Because sometimes, the most powerful royal statement is not a speech. It is a signature.